Before Facebook, before Twitter, before anyone had a cell phone or a cable news channel that spoke to them honestly, Black America already had its own information network, and it was faster, smarter, and more trusted than anything the mainstream media was offering. If you grew up in a black neighborhood in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, you already know what I'm talking about. You watched it happen every week. You heard it in barbershops. You felt it in church. You carried it home in the pages of Jet magazine tucked under your arm. But here's what most people, even people who lived through it, never fully understood. This wasn't just gossip. This was a survival system, a deliberate, organized, community-built intelligence network. And today I'm going to show you exactly how it worked. Stay with me until the end, because the story of the barbershop in Birmingham that passed a warning faster than the police could respond, that one will stay with you. The barbershop was not a place you went to get your hair cut. That was just the excuse. The real reason you went was because the barbershop was the newsroom, the town hall, the courthouse, and the philosophy department, all in one room that smelled like Clubman and hot towels. The moment you walked through that door, you were plugged in. The chair was occupied, so you sat. And while you waited, you listened. Men talked about what was happening 3 counties over. They talked about which white employer was cheating his workers. They talked about which politician had made a quiet promise and broken it just as quietly. Information moved in from every corner, because every man in that chair came from somewhere different and brought something with him. Historians who have studied the civil rights movement have noted something remarkable. In city after city, the coordination of boycotts, marches, and community responses moved faster through barbershops than through any formal organization. Participants would later describe the barbershop as the place where the movement was decided before any meeting was ever called. The barber himself was often the most trusted voice in the room. He had no financial stake in flattering you. He was not the preacher asking for your offering. He was not the politician asking for your vote. He was just a man with clippers and 30 years of watching everything unfold from the same corner. For black families in those decades, the barbershop was the one place where you heard the truth told plainly and without apology. Everything the barbershop did for the men, the beauty salon did for the women, and then some, because the salon sessions were longer, sometimes 4 or 5 hours under the dryer. And in those hours, the world was processed, analyzed, and decided upon. A woman sitting in that chair heard things that would never make the newspaper. Which family on the block was struggling and needed groceries without the shame of being seen asking? Which landlord had crossed a line? Which young man had come home from the military, changed in ways nobody was talking about? The salon was where the community did its emotional accounting, what needed to be carried, and who needed help carrying it. The women who ran those salons understood something profound. Information is care. Knowing what your neighbor needs before they have to ask. That is love made practical. That is community holding itself up with its own hands. Every piece of news that passed through those salons was also a question. Who needs us right now, and what can we do about it? Sunday morning was broadcast day, and the pulpit was the transmission tower. The preacher knew things that arrived in his ear on Saturday and needed to reach 400 people by noon on Sunday. A family had been displaced. A business was refusing to serve the community. A vote was coming that would affect the neighborhood school. The sermon was where it all lived, woven between scripture and song, delivered with a voice trained to be heard from the last pew. But it was not just the formal sermon. It was the moment before service, when the deacons passed information in murmurs by the door. It was the announcements section, which ran long and covered everything from practical survival to political strategy. It was the women of the missionary circle who distributed information about resources, programs, and dangers the way other communities relied on the newspaper. And I promised you the Birmingham story. We're getting there. But first, because what comes next explains why that story happened the way it did, we need to talk about the system that connected all of these nodes together. The system so effective that the FBI spent years trying to understand how black communities seemed to know things before anyone else did. Every black household that could afford it had a copy of Jet magazine, and many that couldn't still found a way to pass one around. Jet arrived in the mailbox and immediately started moving from hand to hand, house to house, until the pages were soft and the corners were rounded from handling. What Jet did was fill the silence that mainstream media created. White newspapers covered black Americans in 2 ways: crime reports and occasional profiles of extraordinary exceptions. Jet covered the life that was actually being lived, the achievements, the politics, the community debates, the deaths that mattered. When Emmett Till's mother insisted on an open casket and Jet published the photographs, it reached nearly every black household in America. That single act of journalism did something that decades of reporting had failed to do. It made the reality impossible to look away from. At its peak, Jet had a circulation of nearly 1 million copies per week. But researchers who have studied black reading habits in the 1960s and 70s estimate the actual readership was 3 to 5 times that number, because each copy was shared so many times. One magazine, 4 or 5 million pairs of eyes, that is a news network. Halsey, before there was a timeline, before there was an algorithm deciding what you should see next, there was the telephone tree. And it worked on the same principle as any modern notification system, except the notifications came from people who actually knew you and actually cared about what you did with the information. One woman called 3. Each of those 3 called 3 more. Within 2 hours, a piece of information that started at a church secretary's desk could reach every family in a congregation of 300. The tree had nodes, had branches, had priorities. Urgent information traveled first. Practical information came next. Community news followed. It was organized. It was intentional. And it worked. What gave the telephone tree its power was something no algorithm has ever replicated: accountability. When Miss Clara called you, she knew if you didn't pass the message on. When Brother James forgot to call the next person on his branch, someone noticed the gap. The network corrected itself through relationships, through the social cost of letting your community down, through love, honestly, because that is what the whole system was built on. The corner store owner saw everyone who came through his door, and everyone who came through his door was on their way somewhere else. That made the corner store the ultimate intersection of information, because the owner was keeping track. He knew which families were behind on their bills. He knew which husbands were working doubles at the plant. He knew when someone's mother had taken sick. He knew before the family sometimes knew themselves, because the grandmother had mentioned it while she was picking up flour. And he passed it along with the care of a man who understood that his store survived only as long as the community survived. His interest in the neighborhood's well-being was not charitable. It was structural. He was the network because the network kept him alive. Remember the barbershop we talked about at the beginning? The way information arrived there from everywhere at once? The corner store was the same but quieter. Less talk, more observation. The barber processed information out loud, in debate and discussion. The corner store owner processed it silently, filed it, and released it precisely when it was needed. Two different styles, the same function, one community holding itself together. When the first black radio stations began broadcasting in the late 1940s and expanded through the 50s and 60s, something happened that the network executives didn't fully anticipate. The DJ became the community's voice. Not just the music, the voice between the music. A black DJ in 1965 could slide a piece of information into his patter between songs and reach every household with a radio tuned to his station. He could announce a community meeting. He could mention carefully that a business downtown was treating its black employees unfairly. He could play a particular song as a signal, a song everyone understood meant something specific, without him ever having to say the words plainly enough to get the station's license revoked. For black families listening in their kitchens, in their cars, in barbershops and beauty salons, the radio was the thread that tied all the other nodes together. The DJ knew what was happening. The DJ told you, and you carried it the rest of the way. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because what we are describing is not nostalgia, it is engineering. The black community built out of necessity, out of exclusion from mainstream channels, out of the simple human need to know and be known, a communication infrastructure that rivaled anything formal journalism was producing. They did it without funding, without offices, without press credentials. They did it with relationships, with trust, with the understanding that information shared in love was the most reliable kind there was. Now, the Birmingham story. It was 1963. The campaign to desegregate Birmingham was at its height, and authorities were watching the movement's leadership closely, tapping phones, monitoring meetings. The plan was to move faster than the community could organize, to arrest the key figures before word could spread. What they didn't account for was the barbershop on 4th Avenue North. A man sat down in that chair on a Tuesday afternoon and mentioned, quietly, what he had overheard that morning. The barber finished the cut. The man left. The barber picked up the phone. By the time the evening church service began, every key organizer in the city had been warned through a chain of calls, whispers, and personal visits that moved faster than any police dispatch. The arrests the authorities planned went sideways. The movement had already moved. Nobody called it a communication strategy. Nobody wrote it in a memo. It happened because a community had spent decades building a network so instinctive, so woven into daily life, that it operated without any single person directing it. It operated on trust, on the knowledge that what mattered to one person mattered to all of them. The next time someone says black communities need to get organized, remember this: they were never disorganized. They were just organized in ways that didn't require anyone else's approval or infrastructure to function. These networks did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the world changed around them. Integration opened some doors.
Television moved into living rooms. The telephone tree gave way to the group chat. The barbershop still exists, but it competes now with 1,000 screens offering faster, louder, and less trustworthy versions of everything it once provided. What we lost in the transition wasn't access to information. We gained more of that than anyone could have imagined. What we lost was something harder to measure. The accountability that came with a network built on relationships. The knowledge that the person telling you something had a stake in whether it was true. The understanding that information was not content, it was care. If you grew up in a household where the Jet magazine was passed around until it fell apart, where the barbershop was the place you first heard your community make sense of the world, where the Sunday service told you everything the newspaper would never print, you already know what I'm describing. You lived inside it. Which of these networks do you remember most clearly? The barbershop conversations, the beauty salon sessions, the voice on the radio that spoke to you like you were family? Drop it in the comments. These stories deserve to be preserved, and the only people who can preserve them are the ones who were there. Hit that like button if this brought something back. And subscribe, because every week we come back here to honor the experiences and the people who made us who we are.